Stephen Pennell, Delaware's only known serial killer, was doing his murdering between 1987 and 1988. Likely murdered 5 women. And it all happened right around this area, Highway 40. And, by day, he was a seemingly regular guy. Married, kids, had a job, he was an electrician. But he would leave his home, his wife and his kids, and drive this road looking for hitchhiking women or sex workers to pick up. He would torture and murder them, likely inside his blue Ford Pennell van, and then he dumped their bodies in remote areas. So I'm going to drive around here and show you the modern day locations, the quote-unquote dump sites, and tell you the crazy story of serial killer Stephen Pennell. So this story really starts a few days after Thanksgiving, 1987. This is the old Baltimore Pike Industrial Park here. And in 1987, it was a pretty quiet spot. And there was a couple that came through this area looking for a quiet little spot to hang out, we'll say. And the boyfriend saw a mannequin laying on the side of the road. He says, that they dumped a mannequin on the side of the road. But in fact, it wasn't a mannequin. It was a body. It was the body of Shirley Ellis. She had signs of being tied up, signs of torture. The autopsy revealed that there was no sexual assault, but she had been killed by a blow to the back of the head with a hammer, which would be kind of a recurring situation with this guy. So she was identified by her tattoos, and her family said that she had left the house around 6 o'clock to go visit a friend at a local hospital. She was walking along I-40, and that was really the last time she was ever seen alive or heard from again. This is the Newark Cemetery, and this is the grave of Shirley right here. I don't know if Tinker was a nickname or what, but Shirley was trying to turn her life around. She, in the past, was a sex worker, but she was going to school to be a nurse, and she was not of that lifestyle anymore. It's my understanding that she jumped into a car to hitchhike to the hospital to visit a friend just a few days after Thanksgiving. And it's unfortunate that she got into Stephen Pennell's car and he murdered her. About 7 months later came his next victim, a second body that was found, and this one was Catherine DeMauro. Where's her grave? Here. She was found in a construction site just south of I-40. Now, apparently she did some sex work in her past. No one knows for sure if she was doing any sex work that night, but she was seen getting into a blue vehicle, a blue van of sorts, and that was along I-40. So who knows? But she was killed the same way as Shirley Ellis, blows to the back of the head and strangulation. And the weird thing is they found these strange blue fibers all over her body. She was found nude it was a construction site at the time. Now it's just a bunch of townhouses. It's a whole complex of houses. So this is the Fox Run Apartments here. But back in 1988, this was a construction site. They were just building them. And this is the location where Catherine DeMauro was found. She was found nude by 2 construction workers, and her body was basically just left in a wooded area. just a private area of this construction site, really. Now, like I said, back at her grave, she had there was blue fibers all over her body. And that was really the first major clue for investigators. But they also knew at that point that there was likely a serial killer on the loose here in Delaware. So Stephen Pennell actually only lived about a half a mile away from here in a trailer park. So I'm going to take you over there right now. But he was pretty bold with this stuff. I mean, really operating in his immediate area, which is crazy, having been, he was out in public. He was a married guy. He had kids. He had a job. He was an electrician. The fact that he was right in his area where he lived, he was murdering these women, pretty crazy. All right, so this is the neighborhood. This used to be all trailers. Like, it was a kind of a cul-de-sac trailer park. And this is where Stephen lived. Now, there's some videos online and some blogs that talk about that he lived in a house. His trailer was pretty much right in here. So now they're all little, kind of like almost tiny houses. They're actually pretty cool little houses. But there's some videos online that say that he lived in a house that's abandoned now, and they go through the house and they say this was his house. He didn't live in a house. He didn't do any murdering in a house. He did his murdering in his blue van, and he lived here in the trailer park with his wife and his 2 kids. But, from 1988, 89, I mean, it's very different now. Now, as for the third victim, it was 26-year-old Kathleen Meyer. And she actually lived in the same neighborhood as Shirley Ellis, the very first victim, although they are not believed to have known each other. But September 10th, Kathleen left her house after a fight with her boyfriend, and she was walking along Route 40, and an off-duty police officer saw a woman matching her description get into a blue van. He wrote down the license plate RV2059, and that registration, sure enough, belonged to Stephen Pennell. Her body was never found, but later on, her blood was found inside the blue van, but more on that later. So this creepy area is down near the Chesapeake and Delaware Canal. And this is where Pennell dumped 2 of his victims' bodies, Michelle Gordon and Margaret Finner. Michelle Gordon was found on the rocks. She was actually in the canal, in the water, and Margaret Finner was found by a hunter near the canal, very badly decomposed, and to the point where they couldn't even really say how she died. She was actually identified with dental records. That was really the only way they could find out who the heck she was. So I don't know if this is the exact area. There was really nothing specific online that said where they were found, but this is a park here area, and it's very secluded still. So this very well could have been where he dumped the bodies, somewhere right in this area at night. So this road that I'm on goes along the C&D Canal, the Chesapeake and Delaware Canal here. Very secluded area, and we are not very far from where the body of Michelle Gordon was found. 22 years old. She was a Newcastle resident, and she disappeared September 16th, 1988. Now, the medical examiner testified that Gordon died while being tortured, as she was a cocaine addict, and according to the examiner, her heart just could not handle the shock of being tortured. And her body was found along the bank of the canal 4 days later. So how was Stephen Pennell finally caught? Well, obviously there was an entire investigation going on, far more involved than I could explain to you here, but some of the notable points of that investigation were Officer Renee Lano Tashner, who actually dressed up as a sex worker, walking along the same routes that some of the girls were seen getting into a blue van. They were actively searching, investigating anyone who had a blue van. Countless hours of the task force and the investigators out there all night long, watching to see who would come up to this undercover officer. Many weeks and months were spent doing this, long nights. The investigators would watch this undercover officer talk to tons of different men who pulled up looking for sex or looking for a quote-unquote good time. It was a very tedious job, a very dangerous job for this smaller female officer. And indeed, one of those nights, a blue van did approach her, where she had a lengthy conversation with this man. Notice that the entire interior of the Ford van that he was in had blue carpeting, and while pretending to be interested in it, she managed to grab some of the fibers while touching it, and that ended up going back to the FBI for an analysis, which indeed did come back to be a match of the blue fibers found on Catherine DeMauro's body. And at that point, they were watching Stephen Pennell very, very closely. They were tailing him. It even got to the point where there were helicopters following him on his nighttime drives, prowling around looking for women. And after an exhausting investigation, many, many months long, they finally had enough evidence against Stephen Pennell, and on November 29th, 1988, in the middle of the night, police raided his trailer and arrested him, charged with murder. During the court procedures, experts testified that bloodstains found inside the van matched DeMauro's, and hair found inside the van matched Gordon's. Also, a tool mark expert was brought in, and he matched marks on the victims' bodies with Pennell's own pliers and hammers that he used at his job. From what I gather, his motivation was not sex, but just domination. He wanted his victims to be kept alive for a period of time. Now, while on the stand, Stephen did admit to picking up sex workers, but not to any murders. Throughout his whole time in court, he seemed very cold, only really showing interest when the prosecution showed images of his victims' bodies. He kind of would prop up his head and look. And on Thanksgiving Day, 1989, almost exactly 3 years from the day that Shirley Ellis was found murdered, the jury came with a verdict guilty of murdering Shirley Ellis and Catherine DeMauro, and a sentence to life in prison ×2. In 1991, he was re-indicted on the murder of Michelle Gordon case and Kathleen Meyer, whose body was never found. New DNA tests found her blood in the blue van. So Pennell told the judge he would plead no contest to the murders of Gordon and Meyer if the state promised to execute him. And to make a long story a little less long, he was, in fact, finally executed. Now, I don't always show the murderers' graves in these videos. Sometimes I do, but I thought it was interesting that Stephen Pennell is in the same cemetery as Catherine DeMauro. just maybe 1,000 feet away, a few hundred feet away, I don't know. But he's buried here with his family. Stephen to the right, and his parents, William and Elaine, to the left. March 14th, 1992, Stephen was put to death by lethal injection, and that was the end of his serial killing days, of course. Crazy story, and I believe he's the very first serial killer to request death, the death penalty. Another strange thing about it is that his wife, I don't know if she was successful or not, but she tried to get back the family van, that blue van that ultimately got him caught. I mean, who knows people's financial situations? Maybe they didn't have any money. Maybe she needed that car back, or the van back, to drive it. Maybe she wanted to sell it so she could buy something else. But just the fact that he likely murdered those women in that van. I couldn't be driving it around with my kids, even just by myself. It's crazy, but it is what it is. That's the story of Stephen Pennell, the very first serial killer in the state of Delaware that we know of. Hope you found it interesting. See you in the next video.